repair shop, Dave Richard, here in Corinth, Vermont. I've been a woodworker and now a luthier, instrument repairman, since about 1983. I was a carpenter. I got into it because I worked as a carpenter when I was in college, and did that for a couple of years, finished college, decided I wanted to make furniture, went to a school for a year, and then I hung out a shingle. And from 1983 to about 5 years ago, 2016, I made furniture and cabinets and did antique restoration full-time. In about the year 2000, a buddy of mine built a guitar, and that got me interested in guitar making and repair. So I started doing that in my spare time, and gradually would take on jobs. I sort of trained myself to do instrument repair, increasingly difficult jobs on my own instruments or freebies or cheapies, and till finally, probably about 10 years ago, I was asked to repair my first Martin. And that went well, and it's been smooth sailing ever since. Well, I've always liked, ever since I started woodworking, I've always liked antiques, fixing old things. I've always liked, since I was in high school, I've always liked swing music, vintage jazz, and arch tops were the guitars that were used in the heyday, 1920s, 30s, 40s of vintage jazz. And about 7 years ago, a friend of mine had a 1939, I started looking for an arch top, and wasn't familiar with Epiphones per se. I was looking for one, and my friend had a 39 Epiphone for sale, and I bought it and got very interested in the history of these guitars. That 39 turned out to be a great guitar. I did kind of the usual maintenance. I did a neck reset, I refretted it. Wonderful guitar, and that just one led to another. The history of the company is very interesting. They made very high quality guitars through the 1930s and 1940s. So it's a nice company to focus on. Although I certainly like Gibsons and Martins, both of whom made arch tops. So I at this point have owned and/or repaired and/or resurrected quite a number of vintage Epiphone arch tops. Different sizes, different years, different models, and almost every one has been an excellent instrument, and they're all quirky and interesting in their own way. So when I was about the year 1970-71, my older brother, I must have been 14 at the time, my older brother announced he was going to get an electric bass. And I thought, I want to be a rock and roll star too, so I got an electric guitar and, played that for many years, played acoustic. I didn't think, for all my years of furniture making and guitar playing all along, I didn't think anything about working on instruments or building one until, as I mentioned earlier, I had that epiphany when a friend of mine built an archtop electric around the year 2000. And that kind of flipped a switch. And since I play guitar, and since I'm a cabinet maker and have a lot of skill with woodworking and hand tools, it was a pretty easy thing for me to pick up and learn the specialized skills involved in instrument repair and building. Initially, I worked on anything I could get my hands on, and at this point, it's flat top acoustics, arch top acoustics, mandolins, I am able to do some repair work on fiddles. I play a little bit of fiddle. So there's nothing I like better than having a quality instrument come into my hands that needs some TLC to be brought back to its best. So I'd say I've been working on instruments for about 20 years now, and full-time about 5-6 years. No, I did not grow up in Vermont. My father went to Dartmouth, which is not too far away from Corinth. My parents bought a house in 1979 in the nearby town, and while I was finishing college I would graduate, and since I had lived all over the United States and traveled quite a bit, once I started visiting Vermont and the Upper Valley and New Hampshire, I realized that once I graduated I was moving to this area to settle. No ifs, ands, or buts. And that's what I did, and it's worked out very well. The landscape of Vermont is gorgeous in a subtle kind of way. It's not like the Rocky Mountains, or it's not like the sea, like living on the coast. It's kind of an enfolding landscape. It's very charming. So there's the physical landscape, and then there's the seasonal changes, which adds to the enjoyment of the landscape through each one. And summer's beautiful, fall is magnificent, winter has its own pleasures. Mud season is not fun, but it just makes one appreciate all the other seasons even more. On the lost highway. When I moved to Vermont, I could identify wood species when it was sawn into planks, but I had no idea how to identify different trees. Well, I became friends with a man in my town at that time who taught a class on spring botany. I took that class and I learned some bird identification and tree identification, and that just enhanced my appreciation of the area I live in. I think the internet has made it much easier to have a small business like this, as far as finding customers and getting the word out for my own skill and finding new customers. I think sometimes young people ask me, "Oh, I see you went to college, you majored in history, and now you're a woodworker, and how does that work? What advice would you have for me as a young person?" And the best advice I can give is find something you love to do and stick with it if you can, because that in the long run is what's going to give one the greatest satisfaction of anything. So I prefer, for myself, I get extreme satisfaction out of something that's broken and bringing it back to playing condition. Actually, whether it's a piece of furniture or an instrument, but there's something truly satisfying about bringing an instrument back to playing condition and having it sing again.
My name is Kathy Chapman, and I'm a stained glass artisan. So I fabricate new windows and restore old windows. I had gone to art school and I studied photography, and before that I'd gone to a high school that taught commercial photography for a couple of years. And so I did photography for many years, and then in order to make my art and support myself, I took up house painting, and that bought me free time to make my art. And so jump ahead, did that for 10 years or so, and then a mutual friend needed help restoring a window in Hanover on 4 stages of scaffolding. And I didn't mind heights because of house painting and whatever. So I went and helped my friend Greg, and after that we just got along great, and we've been partners ever since.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just liked making stuff. So I also like to paint pictures. So I would just start with a blank canvas and just start going and see where that ended up. Stained glass is a little different because it's a process art. So you have to do the artwork first, and then you have to break it down into some geometry and structural, fabric to make it last.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, I started in photography, and I did that for 4 years. But when I was in art school, I also started painting, because photography again is another process art where you have to develop the film, and there's all this time waiting and all these processes that I took up painting because it was immediate, and I could get satisfaction immediately. And then I just never stopped painting. And I still do photography, but I just kept, the painting just took over more and more. And so now, the painting sort of, it translates well into stained glass because there's a lot of lines. It's just, I don't know why it works that way, but it does. It translates really well into glass.
Mm-hmm.
And stained glass is you're painting with light, basically, instead of, pigment. And so what you would do, like over here, is you have the color, and then you would, you take away, right? So you're bringing the light through. It's a different sensibility than painting, than applying paint in a color way. I paint a lot like this. My lines are delineated with black lines. Big blocks of color, very medieval looking, everything's up front, very little depth. That's the kind of glass work I'm attracted to, and conversely, that's how I paint too. I have a long history in Vermont and New Hampshire. My parents were from here, my grandparents were from here. My dad was born in Fairleigh. My mom's from Lebanon, New Hampshire. My father, they had a bunch of kids in a short time, and my father was an art teacher, and so he got a job on Long Island where they moved to, and that's where I was raised. Born in Brooklyn, raised on the island. But we summered here because we had so many, relatives, our grandparents, aunts and uncles and whatnot. My parents had a summer cottage over on Lake Maury, so we would come up here summers, and tons of family, grandparents, and cousins and whatever were around. So I always loved Vermont. This was always my happy place. And so after I got out of school, I was going to travel a little bit, but I knew I was going to come back to Vermont. And that's what I did.
So I'm Jeff Spiegel, sometimes called Jeffoir, and the work I do here is primarily with different kinds of paint and other mediums. So I work a lot on canvases. I've also gotten into doing some woodworking, doing some trestle tables, and making some wood sculptures. If I was to kind of categorize the kind of art that I do, I would say I'm an eclectic. I like combining different mediums, found objects from nature, whatever, and just kind of interacting with them in a way in which somehow in that process a piece of work gets developed. My sister is an accomplished artist, and honestly, I was always envious of her. I went into education. I became a school principal, a teacher, a special educator, and was always wanting to dabble in the arts, and kind of always felt like, God, I wish I was a creative person. And then I had an opportunity of being in a kind of an interesting group that would meet once every other month for a weekend. And in that opportunity, we were often given some creative activities to do. And it was this one evening where we were given a piece of large canvas and crayons, which are oily pastels. And we were asked to listen to the music and simply follow our hands and draw whatever. And this is in a group of 20 to 25 people. I was petrified. It took me a while just to get engaged. When I was finally done, what I had created it looked like a giant ear to me. The facilitator said that she was going to collect everybody's work, and while we all left for the evening, she would hang it up, and the next day she just said two things. One, find your work. Two, notice your reaction when you find it. And during the next day, we would always have our interactive activities in that same room, and I would look around, and for most of the day I could not find my drawing. But at one point we were sitting waiting for the next activity to begin, and I remember leaning over and saying, do you know who did that one over there? And they said no, and I said, yeah, neither do I, but I'd like to, I'm curious, because that's a very strange person. And that evening, when we met again for the final session, the lighting was the same, and we were waiting to begin, and I just casually looked up and I saw that painting that was belonging to someone weird, and I immediately, my face just got hot. I realized I was the weird person. So for the next couple of days, that weekend, actually for 2 more days, and that we had a longer weekend, I didn't go to any of the sessions. Instead, I stayed in my room with the crayons. And after the first day, people were wondering where I was, and they came up, a couple of them, and wondered what was going on, and they saw all the work that I just would put up on the wall and keep going. And they said, you got to bring this down. You got to show this. So that was really my beginning. But at the time, I was a school principal, and I really had no special time that I could set aside for art, except when we would go to Willoughby Lake in the summer for a couple of weeks. I would bring paints, and that's really the only time until I retired. And we used to have animals here on the farm, and I thought it would be nice to bring animals back onto the property. We had just cut down all this ash and cherry, and for 3 days we sawed off posts and beams. We hired a timber framer, and he came and took them all to his mill after we had them kiln dried. And when he brought the structure back and put up this structure, I looked at it and I said, David, it's absolutely beautiful, but it's not a barn. And I remember my wife saying, "Oh, we could put horses in here." And I said, "No, no animals are going in here." So this became the workshop and the painting studio for me. And we started calling this Prince, the building formerly known as the barn. So that really is what opened up the world of art for me, because now I had a space, I had the time, and the motivation. And it's been a great, great journey. I would always say, I paint from here. And I do, I trust that. I trust that that's part of letting go of my concrete reality and getting lost in the work. And I remember someone saying, follow your hands. And I actually taught my students when I was working at a technical high school. I would incorporate painting into our work in terms of analyzing what we do in our program. And I remember telling my students, after I put them through the same experience of collecting their work, hanging it up, and then watching them the next day trying to figure out what is theirs. And the words that I heard were, I can't believe I did that, I don't believe I did that, or some would say, I'm not sure which one I did. So that's the way I think art works for me. It's trusting my unconscious mind. And when I start to work and look too critically, I know that it's time to step away. The most difficult thing that I've learned in the first couple of years that I got serious about painting was knowing when to stop, when to let go, or when just to walk away. So I'm getting better at that because there's always that creeping judgment that's going to sneak in, and that gets in the way of losing what it was that I was actually doing when I was interacting with whatever material I was using. So that's the long answer to, yeah, I guess I'm a semi-abstract kind of guy. So by way of coming here and discovering Corinth was an interesting journey. I was teaching in Harlem at the time and had a girlfriend who had a little Carmen Gia. And it was fall, and she said, how about if we go to Vermont to see the foliage? And I said, what's the foliage? I had no clue. And when we came up here, we came actually pretty close to this area, and I was knocked out. It just touched me. So I came back to New York and saw all my friends and said, I've seen my future. I'm going to buy an old 200-year-old farmhouse that I can restore in Vermont by June. And they all thought I was crazy. And I started coming up here looking around, and ultimately I wound up in a broker's office in Newbury. And she said, so what are you looking for? And I had never really put it together, and that's the kind of synchronistic, or I don't know what you would call it, moment in my life when I just said, I want a 200-year-old farmhouse I can restore. I want it on a dirt road with a stream in front. I want it on 10 acres of land, and I don't want to pay more than $10,000. And the very first place she took me to was here. And I'm thinking, there's no way I can buy the very first house that I have been shown. So I spent the next couple of months all over looking, and ultimately on May 24th of that year, I bought this place. this was where I needed to be. So coming here was spiritual. That first year when I was living here by myself, I just needed to put my hands in the dirt, in the ground. I had a huge garden, and it just felt like this was where I needed to be. And of course, over the years, I went from being a classroom teacher to a special educator to eventually being a school principal. And part of the challenge was that my work took me away from my community. And it wasn't until I left teaching in New Hampshire that I said, I want to come back to Vermont. So I went back to the classroom and taught for 7 years at the Hartford Tech Center, teaching human services. And then my family basically said, you know, you're not getting any younger. You got a lot of projects going on here. You need to simplify things. So I did. I retired, but I felt like now it was time for me to give back to the community. And wasn't sure what that was until I learned more about what this community needed for help. And I did some research on that and talked to organizations that were helping people in this town that we had no clue in terms of what their needs were and what was going on. And it was 2 months before the pandemic was when I formed a small group called the Corinth Community Coalition and made a presentation at the town meeting that March. And then 2 weeks after the pandemic hit, and I was getting phone calls. And at that point, I called the select board and said, hello, we got to get going here. And since that time, we've done some really good things for people in this community. And the thing that I think has impressed me the most is the people who have stepped up. This is a wonderful community. This is my home, and I'm at a point in my life where we've had discussions about the end of my life and how I want that to be. And I've chosen green burial. I want to be here. This is where I belong. This is where I want to leave by renewing this place in some small way. You know, I feel like in many ways I grew up in a different way by living here. And even though I know that this is an interesting stage in my life in terms of my perspective on the past as well as the present and the future, as I said to somebody just a couple of weeks ago, I feel like I'm thriving. I'm thriving in my relationship to where I am, my relationship to my spouse, my partner and my family, my relationship to those closest to me, and my relationship to my community. And I'm a happy guy, and I just look forward to, more of exploring what's here and what's here. So that's pretty much it.
My name is Wade Matteson, and I'm a leather worker. Ever since I could pick up a pencil, I've been drawing, and I've always been very creatively driven. Even like Halloween and stuff like that, I make my own costumes, and I've just always had this passion for this sort of thing, but it's always been kind of back burner, especially when it comes to making things. So I have a friend who is doing leather work, and he inspired me to get into it. He showed me, just like some, entry-level little things, and I just took it from there. I had found myself in a position where I was in a job that I was very dissatisfied with, and some circumstances lined up where I was able to just kind of make a transition into self-employment, which was a process of kind of tripping over my own feet over a few different things, but finally I landed on leather work, and I put out a few things, and had some friends order things from Facebook and this and that, and in a couple of months I started getting some pretty decent traction, and it just kept going from there, and now I'm doing it full time. My sensibilities definitely changed. When I started, I love Renaissance fairs and stuff like that, and when I got into this, I was kind of leaning into the whole niche of making that sort of thing, and in doing so, I kind of found that doing a lot of carving and stuff on a mass scale is it's difficult. It's very time consuming, and I didn't want to cut corners or anything, but I just kind of found my stuff getting a little less and less complicated, and with a focus more on just those little details. Trying to make everything, like you said, as like crisp and defined as I could get them, and not worrying about too many frills. I was surprised by how many artistic people there are here. This community, shortly after I got here, my mother encouraged me to sell this studio tour they do annually, and I had no idea what a studio tour was, and I was just kind of ushered into it, and I was quite surprised and delighted to know that there are so many like-minded people here. It's been a real treat living here. It's very peaceful. Which is just for a quiet mind is good for anything that requires a good amount of focus and attention to detail, and so everything's just been everything about being here is kind of fed into producing satisfactory work. One of the things I really enjoy about leather work is that I've heard it referred to on a number of occasions as being kind of a dying art. And so, not to, sound highfalutin or anything, but I kind of feel like I'm helping to preserve, something that's not so commonly done. And so in doing so, I use a lot of, hand tools, and I don't use industrial equipment or anything. I have a few presses and stuff like that for certain things, but I don't use like sewing machines or anything. Everything's done by hand. It's very tactile, and that's something that I really enjoy about it. And that's something that I found that a lot of people appreciate about it.
Cool.
Yeah.